Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here. And spring has arrived here in the UK. I was walking around London today and it was so hot and sunny. The first time I didn't need to wear a coat in about 4 months. so you know, I'm happy, and it was great to see everybody else just enjoying the sun as well. So I hope you guys, wherever you are enjoying the first throes of spring, or are looking forward to a bit of cooler weather if you're in the southern hemisphere anywhere, or maybe a spot of skiing. That sounds pretty nice, actually. Anyway, so let's get into today's question, and it's a multilingual question from Brazil.
Konnichiwa, Ori-san. Hajimemashite. Thiago desu. Watashi wa Burajiru-jin desu. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. So that's pretty much everything I know in Japanese. I'm just a beginner. So I just would like to ask you a simple question. How important is the culture for learning a new language? For example, can I learn Japanese without caring about the culture? Does it really matter learning the culture with the language at the same time? That's it. That's my question. So, thank you. Bye.
OK。チアゴさん、メッセージありがとうございます。チアゴさんは、日本語を勉強し始めてよかったですね。これから頑張れ。Thanks for the question, man. That was a question in Japanese and English from a Brazilian. So fantastic to hear. Get a bit of a multilingual session going on here. And a very interesting question. And it's one of those questions that we can answer in a number of different ways. Now, can you separate culture from the language? Well, I mean, you know, obviously, the culture is an integral part of the language. In many ways, it's impossible to separate the language from the culture, and it's probably not very desirable to do so either. You know, language exists within a culture and vice versa, and the culture influences the language, and the language influences the culture, and both of these things change over time. So in many ways, it's rather silly to suggest that you can learn the language without the culture. And yet, it also raises an interesting point, because maybe you're not interested in the culture. Maybe you simply want to learn the language for other purposes. Now, I was talking about this the other day in a Facebook group with some really experienced language learners, and we had a bit of a debate about this, actually, about whether or not it is valid to learn. In fact, what we were talking about was phrases, and we were talking about the fact of whether or not, you know, you can learn phrases in a language without necessarily knowing the cultural significance. And, you know, from a kind of worldly viewpoint, you know, you'd be totally entitled to say, well, Ollie, it's ridiculous to ignore the culture because it's part of the language. And it is. And yet, when you're first starting to learn a language, your main priority is not to integrate into the culture. It's not necessarily even to understand the cultural elements of the language that you're learning. Rather, it is to begin to communicate in whatever way possible. Now, when I learn a new language, I like to get to a kind of minimum level of communicative competence as soon as possible. So, in plain English, that means I like to be able to speak as soon as possible. Now, because I'm a beginner, and because I'm in a very early stage, you know, I have no kind of pretense of being culturally savvy or knowing the correct things to do in any situation, which is not to say that I don't want to, but I'm not pretending that I know that I'm culturally literate yet, because I'm just trying to get to a point where I can speak and hold a conversation. Because once I can do that, once I can hold a conversation in the language, like, that's the point for me where I can just double down and really start to learn the language with some depth, because I'm able to have a conversation and I'm able to use that as my kind of vehicle for learning. So I guess, you know, even though in textbooks they often like to teach you about the culture, you know, have a kind of cultural segment of the book or the chapter. And obviously, if you watch movies in the language, so Thiago, in your case, if you're watching movies in Japanese, you're inevitably going to learn about the culture. In spite of that, like, when I'm starting to learn a language, I'm just looking for the quickest, easiest, and most direct way to express myself in the language. And cultural considerations are not on my mind, really. So I would say, you can certainly get to, I mean, I've said this a number of times before. I know that a kind of B1 level in a language, or an intermediate level in a language, is often the cut-off point for many things. And among those things is I think the fact of when culture really starts to become important, because you can learn to speak a language conceptually by just learning the basic words and phrases and become minimally conversational up to a B1 level without any cultural awareness whatsoever, I think. However, beyond that, if you want to move up to a kind of B2 or a C1 level, you need to be able to hold a decent, interesting, effective conversation. And in order to really have a good conversation in the language, this is the point where you can't separate culture. All right. So to give you an example, if you are, I mean, Joe, you're talking about Japanese, and Japanese is a great case in point, because obviously it's got a very distinctive culture, which is different from yours and mine in many, many ways. And, you can sit down with a Japanese person and have a conversation about, I don't know, it could be anything about, you could have a conversation about language learning, and you could cover all the points and, discuss what you want to discuss. And in that case, like, culture might not have anything to do with the Japanese that you use in that conversation. Let's imagine after that you went and you sat down in a restaurant and you started to order food and to have the meal. Well, see, at this point, when you're actually interacting socially, this is where I think it becomes impossible to separate culture, because when you sit down and have a meal in Japan with Japanese people, there are all kinds of little etiquette considerations that you have to observe, and it's very much a kind of formulaic thing. So, you will, the typical thing to do is you sit down, and if your host has chosen the venue, then you'll compliment the venue and you'll say how nice it is. You'll let everybody else sit down first. You will, you won't order your food first. You'll let everybody else order, and then when the food comes, you'll compliment the food and you'll say how good it is. And all these things that we probably wouldn't say in English or Portuguese because it's not a cultural thing to do. But in Japan, this is very much a routine thing to do. And so at this point, if you stray from this kind of formula, if you like, then you're doing something which is culturally inappropriate. So at this point, it doesn't really matter how accurate your Japanese is. If you're not doing it with the etiquette in mind, then you're gonna, you're not. How can we say this? You're not doing a good job, really. And you can extend this to many different aspects of Japanese as well. For example, meeting people for the first time. The way that you exchange the cards and you bow, and the way you answer the phone, for example. All of these different aspects of daily life in Japanese are infused with the culture. And if you aren't aware of that culture, you're going to put your foot in it time and time again and not do very well. And so I think these are the kind of things that when you want to move beyond a kind of basic conversational understanding in the language and up to a higher level, it becomes very, very important. So in summary, I think I'd say that, you should always, I think, aim to understand the culture as best you can. I think as a point of principle, that's a good thing to do. But when you're first getting started, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think you don't need to dive into a very thorough examination of Japanese culture, although I think it would help you if you did, but there's no need. You can just concentrate on the language. But just be aware that when you want to really up your game, when you really want to start to speak the language more naturally and develop deeper relationships with the people that you are talking to, that's when culture starts to become really, really important. And the same thing, I think, goes for any language. Every single language I've learned in every country I've been to, they have their own norms and their own customs and their own different varieties of etiquette, and it's important for you to know all those things, but probably not quite at the beginning. All right, so I hope that's helpful. It's a very interesting question. Thank you very much for that. And if you would like to ask me a question, please do. You can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask and leave me a question right there. I'm also asking for some voice submissions for people for my 100th episode. It's very, very close. So if you'd like to get involved, then all I'd like you to do is to simply leave a message for me saying your name, what language you're learning or where you're from, and then one thing that you've learnt about language learning from listening to this podcast. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to string all of these together and make a cool kind of voice collage of what people have to say. That would be super cool. So please get involved in that. If you'd like to do it, you can go to the same URL. So it's iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask and simply leave that for me there. Now, at the end of every episode, I like to leave you with a resource of some kind on the topic of the show. And today's resource is a post from the Wall Street Journal called "Does Language Influence Culture?" And it's a fascinating look at whether the words that we use, the language that we speak, actually influences the culture of the country. So I'll put that in the show notes, which will be at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 93. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com/podkit, that's PODKIT, to get free access. Inside, you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much, much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com/podkit, PODKIT, and if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.